Hey, it's Annemarie here. I am going live on a number of different places today, talking about monetizing your podcast. So if you see me turning away from the screen, that's because I want to make sure that this message gets out to everybody who is following me, particularly if you're a service-based business who is thinking about starting a podcast as a way to build your reach, as a way to build your reputation as an authority in your field, as well as build your revenue. And there's strategies that you want to have in place. And I want to share some of those today because of something that just happened. Hey, careers beyond motherhood, if you've got a question, leave it here and I'll make sure that I answer that. If you've got a question around monetizing your message, specifically on a podcast. So the reason why I am going live today and talking about this is I received an email from someone who was reaching out to their community because they wanted to start a podcast. And, one of the most important things to do when you're starting anything is to reach out to your audience and to ask them, what do you want what do you want me to cover in my podcast? What are some things that you enjoy listening to that you don't like about podcasts? Let me know. So they're doing homework, they're doing research, which is really very important. And one of the things that they just mentioned in the email that I received was one of the greatest feedback that they received from their audience was, we hate listening to ads in podcasts. We hate listening to ads in podcasts. Now, let me know, if you're a podcast listener, do you enjoy listening to ads? And I'll share whether I like listening to ads or not. And the answer is absolutely no. And that's one of the reasons why I no longer really listen to traditional radio. I no longer really listen or watch television because of the consistent bombarding of advertising material. And Careers Beyond Motherhood, I'd like to grow my podcast this year. I'm at 80 episodes. Would really like to look at sponsors. What's the best way to approach in finding sponsors? Okay, so I've got some tips that I want to share with you, so stick around. One of the things that you want to consider when you're monetizing your podcast, particularly if you are a service-based business owner, every time that you share your message, you are building know, like, and trust with your audience. Every time you even bring other people onto your podcast as a guest, if the guest is speaking into a specific topic that's aligned with where you want to position your thought leadership, that means you're going to continue adding value to your community. So that's absolutely very, very important. But one of the things that you want to consider when you are monetizing your own message on your podcast is that if you're introducing sponsors to the message, because you really are opening up your platform and inviting other people to have their advertising content, whatever that is, it might be an ad or something like that, then that is going to water down your message if you don't consider a couple of things first. Okay, so here's a question here. Do you have to have an audience to have an audience? Do you have to have an audience to have an audience? Well, you have to start off somewhere to have an audience, for sure. But speaking about audiences and sponsorships, if you're a service-based business, you can use your podcast to build know, like, and trust with the audience that you are building, even if that audience is only small. Sometimes what I hear is that when podcast hosts are looking to host their podcast on sometimes a free platform, how those podcast hosts are monetizing their business is through getting advertising. And so, as a personal branding strategist by trade, I'm very mindful about the kind of content that you allow these podcast hosts that are adding ads to your content, as to who are these people. Do you want your name and your reputation and your content to be infiltrated with ads that of companies that you may not even have had an opportunity to, that you've had an opportunity to vet? Do you use that product or service? Are you going to stand behind that particular company? So you need to consider those things. So as far as getting to sponsorships, here are some things that I would recommend. If you are using your podcast to build reach, reputation, and your revenue, monetize your own podcast first. There's a process and systems in place. I share more about that. Haven't got time today to be able to share that. But what I will share at the end is a live that I'm doing next week. It's a 5-day intensive where I talk about the formula, I talk about the framework, and I talk about the pipeline that you want to build. So careers beyond motherhood, before you start to add sponsors to your podcast, I would say to you, what are you doing to leverage those listeners into leads and ultimately paying customers? What are you doing to leverage leads from, your listeners into paying customers? Someone here is on LinkedIn and says, do you have to have an audience to have an audience? No, you don't. And he said, no one is watching you. Well, you know what? Doesn't matter, because with podcast content, with live content, if people aren't watching you live, that's okay, because they will come back and listen to your content. That's a beautiful thing about a podcast. We're talking about podcasting, is if you have the right systems in place, if you have the right structure in place, you're going to be able to nurture on a 24/7, 365 days a year, those relationships from people who do happen to stumble across your podcast. And then, from there, they like what they hear. They'll subscribe and then they'll come back. So you've said here that you have been advertising programs. Fantastic. Someone told you today that she found you from binge listening to previous episodes. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do, and you may already have this in place, is that, as you are creating shows and releasing them, what would be the next step that someone would take to deepen the learnings, the insights? Do you have a free offer? One of the things that we recommend for our clients is to create a podcast series where you dive deeper into your thought leadership content. So someone can subscribe to that, access maybe some show notes, access maybe a quiz, some checklists, something that gets them into action to work on that problem and that the solution that you're offering to a problem that they haven't been able to work through themselves. And that's what you want to do, because the moment that you start to introduce sponsors to your content, particularly, and this is what I have seen quite a bit, the content that the sponsor or the advertiser is advertising doesn't really have value to add to your listenership. And what I mean by that is, if I think back to the limited sponsors that I had for my shows, there was someone who had a book. And so she was sponsoring her book. Her book was what she wanted to sell. Now, her book was on sales. My podcast was called The Ambitious Entrepreneur Show. So I knew that, my ideal clients, or the listeners who are on that, listening to the podcast, were business owners looking to build business. And one of the things they struggled with on a regular basis was sales. So this was valuable content. Who else was advertising? I think back, because I've only had limited sponsors, because I've had thousands over the years of expressions of interest for people who want to sponsor our podcast, but I just won't do it because, number one, I haven't used their service. I don't know what they're like, so I can't, hand on heart, bring these people in and share their message to my audience if I haven't used them, their service or product myself. So I can't validate that it is any good, or I don't really know them very well. So I'm very mindful about that. So our sponsors have been sales. It has also been a VA service, because I know as ambitious entrepreneurs, as businesses who are building their business, they can't do everything themselves. So a natural fit for one of my podcast sponsors was a VA service who could support them in doing all of the activities that they weren't able to do. So the message and the service and the product that my sponsors could offer my audience was, I've used them, used their service myself, or I knew of them and I knew the feedback that they were working with absolute integrity, and all of the clients using their services loved what they did. So be very mindful about, who you allow on to share, your platform, because it can take months. It can take months and months to build connection. And here's one of the things that I have learned and seen and observed over the last 11 years in podcasting is that a podcast audience is very different than, say, a radio audience or even a TV audience. It's a deeper connection. There's a level of trust that is built with your audience. And the moment you start to introduce advertising content, it's kind of like, oh, okay, you almost put this barrier around, or in some instances, you can break that rapport that you're building. So be very, very mindful about sponsors. That's what I would consider. And one thing before I leave about when you're looking at hosting your podcast, be wary of the free hosting podcasts, podcast hosts. I use Blueberry, have used Blueberry for many, many years. It's a paid host, but that's fine because, they don't monetize their platform by adding sponsors. And I know that there's some free platforms, that's how they monetize their platform. So you don't want to get into a situation where you've got all of these podcast episodes on this free podcast host platform, and all of a sudden they reach the stage in their business where they just can't fund their business anymore. And then they have to just, either try and sell it, and who knows what that new purchaser of that podcast host platform is going to do as far as their monetization strategy, or how they monetize is advertising. And so I've heard a couple of podcasts that I know, and I can tell when they have advertising integrated, is because often it's the first thing you hear before the show goes live. You hear an ad. Now that's breaking rapport. So careers by motherhood, you ask, I really want to transfer for my hosting platform. Is that hard to do? No, it's not. It's not hard to do. It's like with anything technical, isn't it? Once you know how to do it, your current hosting platform or the new host platform that you want to transfer your content to should have a step-by-step outline of how to go about doing that. So check up with them what the process would be. And a lot of those hosting platforms have instructions on how you do that. So that's what I would recommend. Do a bit of research first and then follow those instructions. So hope that's helpful. No worries, my pleasure. So really that's what I wanted to jump on today. If you're thinking of starting a podcast, or you have got a podcast already, and it really is started to because you want to build that reputation as an expert. You want to become known as that sought after, whoever you are in whatever industry you are. If you want your name to be mentioned, then I highly recommend you do not consider external sponsorships onto your podcast. So there's external sponsorships, and then there's internal sponsorships. Internal sponsorships is a whole other category, and those I do certainly recommend. I'll share a little bit more in the 5-day intensive. So podcastingwithpurpose.com/intensive, podcastingwithpurpose.com/intensive. We're going live every day next week over 5 days where, we're talking about the mistakes that many podcasters make. We talk about the systems that you have to have in place. We talk about, the processes to have in place so that you really can build that reach. Hello, Mindset and Makeup by Jay Ford. Nice to connect. If you've got any questions about podcasting, monetize your podcast, sponsorship, leave them here and I'll answer them before I go. So just be very mindful about monetizing someone else's message before you monetize your own. If you've got a solid content development strategy in place where you're bringing the best of your knowledge to really support your ideal clients, and you're speaking and providing real value into where they are struggling with and consistently putting out great content, and you've got that system, whereas at the end of each show, there's a call to action for those people who are ready to take that next step. And they've just listened to the podcast and thought, that was so valuable. And then there's this really nice invitation. Hey, if you want to know more, go and sign up for my whatever it is, where I dive deeper into X, Y, and Z. And then those people who are ready to access that and they're ready to take that step, they certainly will with that invitation. So it's always about providing value. When you do that and you have a system that's in place that works for you 24/7, 365 days a year, not everyone who listens to your podcast is at a stage where they're ready to make that decision. But you've got this evergreen content that will continue to be found by people who are your ideal clients who are ready to make that step. And you've got this beautiful call to action, which helps you leverage and nurture those relationships. So hope that was helpful. Don't monetize through sponsorships, external sponsorships. Internal sponsorships is the way to go. And I'll share more in next week's podcastingwithpurpose.com/intensive. All right. Bye for now.